Here we are. We're welcoming Professor Anne Lambright to the Zoom sessions on race and ethnicity, coordinated by the Latin American Studies Program at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Lambright belongs to the Chickasaw Nation in the United States and is a professor of Hispanic Studies and head of the Department of Modern Languages at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Her interests center on Andean literature and culture, human rights and social justice studies, critical transnational indigenous and Native American studies, Latin American film, sonic and visual cultures, and translation theory and practice. She is the author of Andean Truth, Transitional Justice, Ethnicity, and Cultural Production in Post-Shining Path, Peru, published in 2015. That was awarded the Catherine Singer Kovacs Prize for Outstanding Book on Spain and Latin America by the Modern Language Association. I'm so happy it didn't happen the same year that my book was there, because I wouldn't have won never towards that book. The second book is Creating the Hybrid Intellectual Subject Space and the Feminine in the Narrative of Jose Maria Arguedas, published in 2007. Well, actually, it's not the second book. That is it the second or the first?
The first.
The first, yes. And she's also the co-editor of Unfolding the City, Women Write the City in Latin America, also published in 2007. Concurrently, she's completing a critical anthology and translations of selected human rights plays by the renowned Peruvian theater group, Grupo Cultural Yuyachkani. She is going to speak today about that group, a very peculiar, very important, and now transnationally known theater group from Peru that has many unique characteristics that you might know about. It blends, as she explained, Western, Andean, and even Asian cultural components. And it's also been controversial in the sense that some people attribute to the group romanticizing trend, trying to show indigenous cultures as very pure and etc. Something that you can see in Andinismo sometimes, but she's going to refer to that and to other aspects of this group, particularly to the influence of Jose Maria Arguedas for Yuyachkani, and also the contributions of this group to the topic and the practice of interculturalism. So with you, please help me welcome Anne to our university. Welcome, Anne, and you have the floor.
Thank you. That was a really nice introduction, Mabel. And first I want to say I love talking about Yuyachkani. And so I'm really grateful to be here. I'm speaking with you all. I always feel like I learn as much as I share in these types of conversations. And I do want to clarify something, because people, when they learn that I work on Yuyachkani, they automatically think that I am a theater person or a theater expert, a theater scholar, right? And I'm not at all. I, in fact, know, honestly, very little about the rest of the theater world in Peru. And I have friends who are true scholars of Peruvian theater, and I would hate to take any of their limelight. I come to Yuyachkani from a different angle and with different interests. I really came to Yuyachkani through Arguedas. While I was working on my first book in Arguedas, 20 years ago, I was very graciously hosted by Yuyachkani and their Casa Yuyachkani in Magdalena del Mar. And I have kept up with them since then. In my previous institution, Trinity College, I hosted them for 3 residencies. And I have been spent many hours with them in Lima, even in Paucartambo. I'll talk about that in a bit. But my interest in Yuachcani has always been this question of indigenous cultures, race, how it appears in literature, film, and other cultural products in Peru. So that is really my angle. So I wanted that to be clear as to where I'm coming from. Also, I had talked a little bit with Mabel about the challenge of this talk. I wasn't really sure about the audience, and I understand that there, are those of you, I see some of the names popping up who know a whole lot about Peruvian culture, and others who maybe are just learning about Yuachcani for the first time. So I'm trying to balance that, and that it be interesting for the one side and yet comprehensible for the other. I have some quotes in Spanish. Most of them I just automatically translated to English, but a few of them I left in Spanish, and I'll put the translations on the slide because I wanted the Spanish to be heard in a few instances. So with that, I will share my screen. And start. I have about 40, 45 minutes of talk, and then am very happy to have a conversation afterwards. The last century has witnessed significant articulations and rearticulations of indigenismo and andinismo in Peru, as intellectuals and activists contemplate how to best define the heterogeneous cultures that have developed in the Andean region since the arrival of the first Europeans almost 500 years ago, and how to best understand the role of indigenous cultures in the national imaginary and in various modernizing political and social projects that have marked Peruvian history. While these discussions have been led prominently by sociologists and anthropologists, with key contributions by literary and cultural studies scholars, certainly, I propose that Grupo Cultural Yuachcani, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year, has developed into one of the key theoretical voices on defining and locating lo andino in contemporary Peru, through its methodical and meticulous development of a poetics, or perhaps more aptly, a theatrics of race. The Yuyas, as they are affectionately known, began as a group of young actors with a mission to take politically engaged pedagogical theater to disenfranchised groups. As testimony to where the group began in its understanding of lo andino, actress Teresa Rally recounts the origin of the group's name, which in Quechua means I am thinking, I am remembering. It was first used in 1970 as the title of a mimeographed pamphlet through which the newly formed collective published and distributed copies of Peter Weiss's 14 Principles of Documentary Theater. And I'll quote Rally. We said it has to have a Quechua name because we wanted to identify with the majority culture in Peru. At that time, there wasn't research on the richness of the nations that exist in Peru. So we understood the Andean world as one immense block. The act recognizes the importance of Quechua in Peru, but as Rally herself admits, in those early years, the group lacked the necessary knowledge to complicate the dominant national narrative on the Andes and its place in national culture. Their well-known foundational story tells of a performance of an early social realist work, Puño de Cobre, or Copper Fist, for a group of campesinos in the highland mining town of Alpamina. In keeping with contemporary aesthetics, the group presented a bare theater in open air, dressed in jeans and t-shirts with minimal props. After one such presentation, artistic director Miguel Rubio recounts, a miner approached them saying, "Compañeros, muy bonita su obra, lástima que se hayan olvidado sus disfraces." Rubio recalls, "Por supuesto que nosotros no nos habíamos olvidado de nada. Esa era nuestra propuesta teatral. Mucho tiempo después comprendimos por qué los mineros pensaron aquello. Faltaba algo que iba más allá de los disfraces. No estábamos tomando en cuenta las expresiones artísticas de los mineros. Es más, no las conocíamos. ¿Cómo podían imaginar una obra sobre ellos sin sus cantos ni las ropas de sus mujeres y sin personajes que cuenten historias y que dancen? With that breakthrough, the group began its now famous travels throughout the country, learning songs and dances from different regions, primarily but not exclusively the Andean highlands, studying characters associated with local festivals, incorporating mask and costume traditions, and learning Quechua. An early companion of these endeavors would be the fiction and anthropology of Jose Maria Arguedas, renowned Peruvian writer whose suicide in 1969 would still be fresh in the memory of the young, mostly Limeño actors. Through his narrative fiction in novels such as Yaguar Fiesta, Los Ríos Profundos, Todas las Sangres, and the posthumous El Zorro de Arriba y El Zorro de Abajo, punctuated by numerous ethnographic essays, Arguedas sought to create a vision of Peru in its complex heterogeneity, a nation space marked by a diversity of cultures in constant contact, conflict, and tension. Arguedas' attempt to translate Andean cultures to national and international audiences, an insertion of lo andino into the dominant Peruvian imaginary through representing in Spanish and in Western literary forms, indigenous and mestizo cosmologies, mythologies, symbolic systems, and social practices, would provide Yuyachkani a model for negotiating Western and Andean epistemologies. Yuyachkani is well known for its theatrical aesthetics, which draws on a unique, truly cosmopolitan blend of Western, Andean, and even Asian performance traditions. It is now commonplace to comment on lo andino in the work of Yuyachkani, but most who do so readily focus on a readily evident oral, visual, and thematic repertoire. The use of Quechua, the deployment of Andean music, dance, masks, and costumes, and the use of characters from popular highland festivals. The danger in such assessments, however, is to suggest that Yuyachkani falls into the type of Andeanism famously criticized by Oren Starr in 1991, which romanticizes the Andes as a place of untouched, authentic indigenous culture, which in its persistence has somehow managed to remain outside the flow of modern history. Moving beyond this facile assessment of Yuyachkani's highly original poetics of race requires interrogating the group's Andeanism by placing its corpus of over 30 plays in direct dialogue with some of the most important thinkers of race and ethnicity in Peru, many of whom the group directly references in essays, interviews, and the plays themselves. Certainly, in early projects such as Alparaiku, which explores land takeovers by indigenous communities during the agrarian reforms of the 1970s, one can glimpse a conversation, purposeful or inadvertent, with Jose Carlos Mariátegui, one of the first to look at historical and contemporary Andean cultures and social structures to contemplate the possibility of a workable socialist project in Peru. In multiple layers throughout Yuyachkani's work, one appreciates resonances of Rodrigo Montoya's articulation of a socialismo mágico, a social, cultural, and political concept that embraces Andean culture, knowledge, and spirituality, while retaining the best of Western modernity, which for Montoya are the ideals of emancipation and social justice, values also core to Yuyachkani's corpus. While I have not found direct references to Aníbal Quijano in writings or interviews of Yuyachkani members, I do see in their work echoes of his critique of coloniality of power and his call for an intercultural communication. Yuyachkani pays homage to specific theorists in plays such as Encuentro de Zorros, which narrates the arrival of a Serrano escaping the violence of his home region by immigrating to Lima, where he encounters other forms of violence as he attempts to integrate into urban culture. Encuentro de Zorros recalls José Matos Mar and his theory of the desborde popular, an overflowing of popular culture brought about by massive internal migration that for Matos Mar defines Lima of the 1980s. Yuyachkani's dramatization of the desborde popular points to their understanding of lo andino as not confined to the rural Andes, but rather intricately woven into all elements of the fabric of contemporary Peruvian culture, even in those sectors that attempt to suppress it. Their 1989 play Contra el Viento is dedicated to Alberto Flores Galindo, author of the classic essay En Busca del Inca, In Search of an Inca. Flores Galindo proposes that, and I quote, the Andean utopia has three dimensions. Not only does it attempt to understand the past or provide an alternative to the present, but it also seeks to discern the future. This theory vastly opens up theatrical and theoretical possibilities for the group and prompts a deeper exploration of myth as cultural and political element. In his essay, En Busca de la Teatralidad Andina, In Search of an Andean Theatricality, Rubio reflects on the theatrical heritage of the Andean region through his observations of on the festival of the Virgen del Carmen in Paucar, Tambo, an annual event that has had a profound impact on Yaxcani's theater. For Rubio, visits to the festival revealed to the group a non-European Andean theatrical originality, which, quote, made us suspicious of certain universal and hegemonic criteria that establish what theater is. Rubio comments that, I quote, defining lo andino continues to be difficult for us because of the difficulty of integrating the millenarian past and its diversity into a contemporary vision of the Andean world that is, in light of its transformations in the present. Arriving at that understanding of the complex diversity of the Andean world was and continues to be a process informed by rigorous study, fieldwork, and experimentation. While the influences on Yaxcani's Andean thought are multiple and varied, none has been more impactful or resonates more consistently throughout their corpus than the work of José María Arguedas. More than any other thinker, Arguedas pushes the group from a static understanding of lo andino, dominant among academics in the 70s when the group began, towards a staging of interculturality that, I argue, should place Yaxcani as a major contributor to the debates on the place of lo andino in Peruvian national identity. Arguedas' ability to break with the modern versus traditional, or rational versus mythical magical dichotomies when speaking of Western and Andean cultures in Peru is a model that Yaxcani has followed and has been able to develop and adapt to a contemporary reality unfathomable to Arguedas at the time he was writing. Yaxcani's indebtedness to Arguedas is noted on many levels. Beyond their direct acknowledgement of his influence on their work, many of the plays overtly or subtly cite Arguedas. Alparraiku, the 1978 play that launches the Yaxcani aesthetic, begins with a reading of the Arguedas poem, Tupac Amaru Kamak Taitan Chisman, a nuestro padre creador Tupac Amaru. Los Músicos Ambulantes explores the trope of todas las sangres, all the bloods, by uniting four characters who represent major Peruvian regional cultural groups in a collaborative creation of a musical feast. Contra el Viento references the Jaguar Maju, or River of Blood, and the dead Tambo Bambino Macta, young man from Tambobamba, that are the subject of a song cited by Arguedas in an anthropological essay. Encuentro de Zorros picks up on the theme and mythological tropes of Arguedas' last novel, El Zorro de Arriba y El Zorro de Abajo, the fox from above and the fox from below, moving the mythical foxes from Chimbote to Lima. A more recent play, Cartas de Chimbote, or Letters from Chimbote, is a direct homage to Arguedas, a verbatim style theater, or a verbatim theater style citation of correspondence with his Chilean psychiatrist, Lola Hoffman, and North American anthropologist, John Murra, along with the diary and fictional segments from the novel, El Zorro de Arriba, El Zorro de Abajo, and finally, his suicide note. The richest citations of Arguedas, however, may be the least obvious. Drawing on what they learned through their extensive fieldwork, Yaxcani presents an exploration of race and ethnicity incorporated both by the actors and their public. In Yaxcani's hands, the sociocultural and political categories of race and ethnicity, in this case, Andean, indigenous, and mestizo identities, are fully embodied, embraced through language, but also through silence, emotion, sound, dance, music, dress, interactivity, relationships, time, space, even tastes and smells. As with all good theater, these elements are not haphazard nor merely decorative. Rather, they are carefully chosen from the vast archive of Andean cultural expressions and curated towards a complex and nuanced expression of Andeanism that defies easy classification within designated cultural performance traditions. Arguedas knew that part of the key to understanding Andean culture was through its music and dance. For that reason, these were such omnipresent forces in his novels. But Yuachcani can do something that he couldn't. They can materialize the dances, the music, even the sounds of the Quechua language that Arguedas found so sweet. Indeed, Quechua is brought to the forefront in Yuachcani's work. Entire scenes may be formed in Quechua, with little or no explanation for the non-Quechua speakers in the audience. And the difficulties of linguistic communication in Peru are dramatized in many plays. The Yuachcani also bring popular Andean folk and festival characters to life, as we see in the appearance of the Equeco, the Arcángel, and the China Diabla in Contra el Viento, the Cajacoya in Adiós Ayacucho, or Santiago Matamoros and the Illapa in Santiago. These figures appear to the audience in rich costume. They dance, sing, and interact with the public. In preparation for Alparraicu, for example, the group traveled among various villages in the highlands, learning dances and songs directly from the groups of campesinos. According to Rubio, this is where Yuachcani begins to feel, or quote, feel and perhaps understand the complexity of the Andean spirit. Later, with works such as Contra el Viento and Encuentro de Zorros, the group explores the political possibilities of, to quote Rubio, the mythical register as a way to approach a complex reality. This notion of complexity permeates the groups, particularly Rubio's writings and discussions of Andean peoples and cultures. Their dramatic explorations of Peruvian reality and the place of Lo Andino within it develops over time as a unique and recognizably Yuachcani political aesthetic. Alparraicu is perhaps the first play that cements Yuachcani's political aesthetic framework for future theatrical approaches. The play recounts the takeover of a highland hacienda after the 1969 Ley de Reforma Agraria under the government of Juan Velasco Alvarado. Alparraicu shows the campesinos and campesinas as politically astute, engaged, and forward-thinking. While political thought is voiced through the speeches of several characters, the Yuachcani had learned through their apprenticeship in Andean performance practices the importance of other forms of embodied political expression, knowledge creation, and embodied political exploration, knowledge creation, and expression. As Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui observes, quote, in a colonial situation, that which goes unsaid contains the most meaning. Words mask more than they revealed, and symbols take center stage, end quote. Indeed, the play highlights sonic and visual symbols, songs, instruments, dances, costumes, and festival acts that elevate these features from mere folklore to political expression. These cultural products are at once transparent and opaque for a non-Indigenous audience. The public witnesses the resistance and follows the basic storyline of rebellion and social transformation. However, many cultural aspects of Alparraicu, from the Quechua speech and lyrics, to the meaning of particular musical forms and dances, to the social structures and norms portrayed, are not fully understood by non-Andean audiences. Towards the end of the play, after the land takeover has been resolved, a campesina addresses audience members, emphasizing this point. Por la lucha ya no éramos los mismos. Diferentes nos hemos sentido. Seguramente tú no comprenderás lo que es querer siempre a la tierra y olerla feo como si tuviera sal. ¿Comprenderás acaso lo que es sembrar para todos y sienta que la tierra recuperada ya no llora ni tiene odio para nadie? Sembrar así, así, poniendo nueva semilla nuestra ya y verla crecer verdecita. Seguro tú no entenderás lo que es ver siempre casa de patrón como casa de fantasma, agachando la cabeza, doliendo en oreja su voz fea, que no dejaba pensar. ¿Sabrás lo que es entrar en esa casa que nunca conocíamos sin tocar suelo con la frente? Todo hemos tocado, su cuchara, su plato, sus ropas, grandes eran sus camas. ¿Sabes cómo es hacer todo eso y no tener miedo? This emphasis on a lack of understanding, on a cognitive and experiential distance and dissonance among the various social sectors that make up Peru will persist in later Yachkani works. In this case, it seems a simple statement of fact, more than a reproach, an invitation towards mutual understanding rather than an irreconcilable barrier. As in Arguedas's narrative, Yachkani's portrait of cultural and epistemological plurality takes place not only on the level of plot, but also in the very staging of the challenges and possibilities of intercultural communication. Like Arguedas's novels, Yachkani's works are dialogical in a Bakhtinian sense, multilingual and pluricultural, with multiple layers of meaning and registers that are comprehensible in different ways and most likely never completely to each individual audience member. Like Arguedas, Yachkani is acutely aware of the diversity not just of its subject matter, the Peruvian nation, but also of its audiences. Like Arguedas, the Yachkani see themselves as communicating on a larger plane, if indeed they need to recognize and adopt Andean performative and aesthetic modes in order to communicate to an Andean campesino population. They also need to find a way, for practical and political reasons, to translate that Andean aesthetic to a larger national and international audience, if the goal is indeed understanding and solidarity without reducing Andean culture to easily consumable terms. Yachkani seems to be referring to this phenomenon in the following exchange between the fox from above and the fox from below in Encuentro de Zorros. Zorro de arriba. Manan hamutanichu. No entiendo. Zorro de abajo. ¿Qué no entiendes? Zorro de arriba. ¿Cómo cuentas? Confundes un poco y no podemos seguir. Zorro de abajo. Tenemos que seguir. Los zorros tenemos antigua fama de ser viejos y sabidos, de conocer cómo se huele el cambio de las cosas. Nos juntamos solo cuando ese olor apesta y el mundo se va al voltear. ¿No fue así antes? Zorro de arriba, cierto. Hace 2500 años nos vimos por primera vez en el cerro de la Tausaco de Huarochirín. Luego, ¿cuánto no tuvimos que esperar para que ese hombre herido de nuestros dos mundos nos juntara de nuevo en el 68 a contar historias de Chimbote? Nos conocemos, pero no tanto. Hemos escuchado nuestras voces, el zorro de arriba y el zorro de abajo. With this dialogue, Yachkani points to the project of translation and mutual intelligibility or interculturality that they engage. We know each other, but not so well, the fox from above charges. In working with and through that understanding, Yachkani's project is one of decolonizing knowledge that is not simply informed by, but also made possible through Arguedas's breakthrough. Arguedas's great search and his great frustration was for a literary language that would accommodate Andean epistemologies, translation but not consumption, and intercultural communication, to use Quijano's term, that might encourage solidarity with indifference. Within Arguedian discourse, this mutual intelligibility requires recognition and acceptance of certain impenetrable zones, recognition of the impossibility of absolute communication. Doris Sommer illustrates this point in her personal account of viewing Santiago, a play set in rural Peru after the Shining Path conflict, about a young indigenous sacristan who refuses to play his expected role of the Moor in a local festival. Sommer comments on the reaction of the audience, an international mix of academics and activists. She notes, and I quote, "We felt more than we understood. This is the stunning point. The language that played out the tension between indigenous refusal and Creole authority was a language we didn't understand. Most of the debate took place in Quechua without translations. Although the conversation slipped into Spanish often enough for outsiders to understand the argument, we also understood how excluded we were from the scene. The act of excluding us performed the kind of cultural estrangement that was at play on and off stage. Paradoxically, it made us participants in the standoff. Summer goes on to explain that after the performance, Miguel Rubio informed the audience of the multiple layers of meaning that they had missed. The Quechua used contained markers of class, ethnicity, and social positioning, understandable only to native speakers. The sense of estrangement experienced while witnessing the play carried over to the streets of Cusco, where the audience members were attending a conference. The members of the group expressed surprise at the, quote, resiliency of Quechua in everyday Andean life. Perhaps were they more familiar with Arguedas's or Yachgani's work, or even just a bit more of the country they were touring, they would not have been so surprised. But the point is that many of us still unintentionally submit to a form of multiculturalism that forgets or suppresses epistemological diversity. Plays like Santiago force us to engage it. Given the array of engagements with the vast cultural and epistemological diversity that Yachgani dramatizes, at first glance and on the surface, the play that most frontally engages Arguedas may seem a surprising choice of subject matter. Carta de Chimbote directly addresses the group's relationship with Arguedas, satisfying what they refer to as a long overdue debt to Taita, as they refer to him, or father, Arguedas. The play follows what we might call the agonizing Arguedas, focusing on the diaries interlaced with fiction in El Zorro de Arriba, El Zorro de Abajo, as well as the personal correspondence with his Chilean psychiatrist, Dr. Lola Hoffman, and his friend, US anthropologist John Murra. In this style of verbatim theater, the actors recite long passages where the author recounts his struggles to write and his contemplation of suicide. Within the context of Yachgani's Andean-focused plays and their customary political thematics and aesthetics, the focus on Arguedas's mental health may seem out of place and even uncomfortably exploitative. Has it not been another Arguedas, the demonio feliz, the no aculturado, that has been informing the group's work for decades? The play begins with the actors themselves, the actors as themselves, offering some reflections on Arguedas before moving into a reading of selections from the letters, diaries, and the novel. In reading the script alone, the play seems a fragmented collection of odd lines and commentaries that have little to do with race and ethnicity in Peruvian reality, a strange homage to the life of a man so dedicated to that topic. However, it is in the staging, the embodiment of these words, that the place of Lo Andino becomes evident. Arguedas's words are framed and supplemented by the actors singing in Quechua, and passages of the letters to Hoffman are recited in Quechua after being read in Spanish, as if the group were conjuring up what Regina Harrison calls the Quechua substratum in Arguedas's work, and in turn in Peruvian culture. Towards the end of the play, the mythical foxes make a second appearance in the Yachgani repertoire. They speak of their history together, from the myth of the Huarochiri through Argueda and Chimbote, and to this moment. Zorro de arriba. Todo ese fermento está, y lo sé desde el punto de mis orejas, y veo, puedo también como tú ser lo que sea. Zorro de abajo. Es hora de irnos. El escritor nos ha soltado. Sigamos corriendo de uno a otro lado de nuestros mundos, desmenuzándolos. Los dos zorros. Los zorros tenemos antigua fama de ser viejos y sabios, de conocer cómo se huele el cambio de las cosas. Solo nos juntamos cuando el olor apesta y el mundo se va a voltear. These last words are not from the foxes Huarochirí encounter, nor from their Argalian dialogue in Chimbote, but rather are verbatim, as you may have noticed, from the earlier Yaxcani play, Encuentro de Zorros, where the foxes appeared in 1980s Lima. They were summoned by Yaxcani and are now appearing on the stage in the place where the play is being represented, wherever that may be. The foxes, in other words, are brought into our world to communicate with us. We must ask ourselves then, what is it in our midst that the foxes are smelling? What is rotten and in need of upheaval? Which may also lead to the question of what is in need of healing. As throughout the play, we witness the slow buildup to a final ritual honoring the dead author, an Andean-inflected communal feast in which the audience is invited to participate, called by the actors singing the huayno Negra del Alma, repeating the line, Cúrame de la herida que has abierto en mi pecho, cure the wound that you've opened in my chest. For Arguedas, a great part of his wound was, of course, the state of ethnic and racial affairs in Peru. Yaxcani seems to be saying that for the audience, that wound persists. Their racial poetics, their complex theoretical, political, aesthetic project, which draws on the vast repertoire accumulated over 50 years to speak theatrically from multiple margins and subject positions within the radical heterogeneity of a country like Peru, seeks to bring us closer to addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'm gonna remove the spotlight so we can open the question and answer. I don't know, Mabel, you're muted. Estás en silencio, Mabel.
Okay. And I was just saying that you did a wonderful job in making a complex topic very accessible and giving a very complete idea about, you know, the work of this theater group and, you know, especially the connections of these kind of performances with the Peruvian thought or Andinismo in general and the problem. I was thinking about Gamaliel Churata, for instance.
Yes.
They are, of course, not explicit connection, but there is a lot of, you know, the same problematics and a similar approach to the connection between the universal and the local. You know, there are many things that could be done. And I also saw, you know, coloniality, and I don't think that Quijano ever referred explicitly to the group. I'm not sure.
No, I don't think I don't think so.
Yeah, but obviously something that has a lot to do with his understanding of the Peruvian post-colonial situation and the, you know, the continuation of colonial structures. Very, very interesting. I think there were some people listening today from the School of Theater at WashU. I'm not sure if they are present now, but in any case, let's open the floor to any questions that, or, you know, elaborations from the public. Just let us know. Can you see everybody, Nacho, or?
Yeah, and you can raise your hands or you can put questions in the chat. I can read the chat once because the chat is directed to me, but we can do either. So I see Sara del Carmen Camacho, I think.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for this amazing lecture. Coming at this from both a theater perspective and also on my surface exposure to Latin American studies, I was curious to know to what extent is Yaxcani able to serve this in a way that is useful to cultural awareness? I guess the thoughts are still percolating in my mind, but is this useful for the people that they're talking about, for the cultures that they're speaking about? Because in my perspective, in working in a lot of theater in the California Bay Area, the stories that are being told aren't reflected in the audiences oftentimes, and the cultural awareness and the exposure of suffering and hardship is often served to more privileged audiences because they are the ones who can fund it. So I was wondering what parallels or problems you could expose there.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you've given me an opportunity to talk about it, because Uyachkani is extremely serious about and dedicated to connecting with the Andean audiences that they've learned so much from. And a few examples that I can give you, I don't know how much you know about Peruvian history, but between 1980 and 2000, more or less, the country experienced a very violent civil war. And the indigenous peoples were by far, indigenous Quechua speakers actually, by far the largest group of victims. And Uyachkani has throughout the years used theater as a method of healing, and has conducted a lot of workshops, especially with women of sexual violence during the war. And one of their most famous works, it's one that I did not talk about today because it's one where the Andean element is not readily evident, even though I do find it quite there. It's Antigona, which is a version of Sophocles' Antigone. And they take Antigona and read it with the indigenous women. And one thing I find quite striking about that is that just as they are quite committed to bringing Andean culture to Western audiences, they are also quite committed to the fact that Sophocles belongs with Andean indigenous Quechua speakers, right? And so the Antigona, which is a one-woman play where the main actress, Teresa Rally, takes on all of the characters in the Sophocles play. She brings them all into her body. To speak about this, great act of rebelliousness, of political rebelliousness, was developed in workshop with Andean indigenous women. So that's one example. Another example could be that the very same plays are performed in different contexts. And one of them I will mention is Rosa Cuchillo, which is a play that was developed in 2000 to accompany the group's human rights work, and I can talk a little bit about that as well. But it's also a one-woman play, and the protagonist is a dead mother who has lost her child to the political violence, and she's walking through the afterlife trying to find him. That play has, because it's portable, it's been performed all over the world. And I recall coming across, and you can find it online actually, what you see pictures of them. I was not at this particular event, but during the Truth Commission public tribunals, where people were coming to give witness to their account of what happened to them during the Civil War in Ayacucho, which is one of the regions where the violence was most located. Rosa Cuchillo was presented and would also walk through the town, and you see these pictures of indigenous people who were coming up and actually giving their testimony to the character Rosa Cuchillo, right? And so you see this intense connection and great interaction. I contrast that with a video that I found online of Rosa Cuchillo being presented at Brown University, and I highly recommend looking at it. On the one hand, you get to see the play, but to me, you have to look at the audience and the interactions. It is so uncomfortable. It's Rosa Cuchillo, this dead indigenous woman, coming to place herself and to speak in front of, actually tell a very horrific story of her life to basically a sitting down audience of white privileged people. And the dissonance there, it's very uncomfortable, it's very striking. So it's something that I want to explore more, how these characters connect, but they are very, very purposeful. That it is not something that they are creating for a non-Indigenous audience specifically. They need to live, and traveling to the US and other places and having their residencies and such is very helpful. So, you know, I say practical and political purposes, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else?
Loris?
Hello, yes, thank you so much for this talk. This was really fascinating. I'm sort of, my question is actually related a little bit to the previous question, because I was also, I was really interested by what you were saying right at the end, what you were describing about the end of this, this performance piece or this play with the sort of the feast in honor of Arguedas. And I was really interested in what you said about the audience, the aspect of audience participation, and the aspect of, or the, you know, the political work of healing and of, I guess you could say, remembrance and in relation to racial trauma and things like that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and the role that, I mean, so I this was perfect because you had just addressed some of this in the previous question, but I was really interested in hearing more about the role participation tends to take in their work, and also that sort of in relation to the subject, their own subject position. Like, maybe you addressed this in your talk.
I didn't actually, as much as I was thinking as I'm going through that, I didn't. So I'm glad that you asked that question. So they have different types of plays and performances. Some are more interactive and some less so. In this particular play, in Cartas de Chimbote, as I said, audience members are invited to a feast that's very similar to a feast that one might participate in at a funeral in an Andean town. There are other, one of the things that I find very interesting about them is how they use smells and tastes. So in Rosa Cuchillo, there is a moment of purification where rose petals that have been soaking in water. So you get this like smell of rose as part of a healing process. At the end of Caipunco, oranges are shared with the audience. And these are all touching on different aspects of different traditions throughout the Andes. But they started out as a group of young university students in Lima, right? Only one of them was a Quechua speaker, Augusto Casafranca, who is from Cusco, grew up in Cusco, and he was a native speaker, but the rest of them learned Quechua really as young adults. And they are very aware of their subject position. So it's something that I think that is always with them as they are creating. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot more I could say about this, but I don't know if it answers your question or.
Yeah, if I could just ask a quick follow-up question, I'm just curious: is it a static membership, or have they, if they've been working really so long, have they been integrating new members?
So they kept they yes, to an extent, but mostly the group is the group that started 50 years ago, and there are questions about, well, what's going to happen to the Uyachkani corpus because it's so particular to them, and every even every character is quite particular to a particular actor or actress. They're not interchangeable, so there is a big question about what is going to happen to the Uyachkani corpus. You know, who can take that on? It's not like, you know, a typical dramatist-driven play that can be performed by different companies. That said, they do a lot of work with young people, and every pre-COVID, they would often in the summer host residencies where students from all over the world could go to study theater. They have a very interesting relationship with Puerto Rico, and a lot of current Puerto Rican actors and actresses have studied in Uyachkani, but they also do a lot of work with young people in different urban environments in Lima. The last time I was there, I witnessed one of the actresses working through a play with a group of young people about domestic violence among young people. So I think they're committed to transmitting an ethic and certain practices also of theater. They're very almost militant in the way that they practice physically as they are preparing, right? And they are committed in, I think, transmitting a way of making theater and a way of theater being in the world, without necessarily transmitting the works that they've created now. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, and if I could just ask one more follow-up question, then I'll stop asking questions because I want to leave time for others. But I'm just sort of curious, you've mentioned their international work, and I'm just curious how recognized they are within the Peruvian national context, if they're very well known and sort of have more like of a lot of cultural prestige, or whether they're more of like a fringe kind of. And then in relation to that as well, this is sort of a side question, but I'm just curious, what their play about Antigona really makes me think of the Mexican Sara Uribe's Antigona González. So I was wondering if they've been in touch, if they're in connection, or if that's...
Yeah, so that I don't know. There is a huge tradition of Antigones throughout Latin America. And oh gosh, I'm drawing a total blank on her name. She's a scholar at Yale, has written a book about the Antigonas in Latin America. I will remember that as we go along. I will remember her name. But yes, they are very, very, they're a cultural institution by now, yes. And in fact, Antigona was developed as part of, as was Rosa Cuchillo and, Rosa Cuchillo and Antigona were developed as part of, or in response to a request by the Truth Commission that they help go into the areas where the Truth Commission was going to conduct their interviews and help prepare the local people to testify, to have faith and to understand the importance of testimony. So during the internal violence, they were often threatened. I think that their strategic development of relationships outside of the country gave them a high enough profile to protect them. But they're very, very, very well known both in Peru and really in Latin American theater, beyond.
I have a question in the chat from Carla Aguilar, who has connection problems, so she asked me to read it. It says, "Thank you for your presentation. Have you thought about the relationship between temporality and translation as performed by this theater group? For example, how speaking in Quechua challenges the simultaneity of theatrical performance and audience reception and embodies cultural difference as affect?"
Not in that way, but that is a really interesting question. So I'm actually myself, as Mabel mentioned, in the process of translating some Uyachkani plays, and I come across into English, and I've come across the conundrum of how to transmit by translating into English this bilingual, bicultural reality of the plays, and I think in that conundrum, as I'm working along, I can feel somewhat this tension of the linguistic battles, I guess, in the moment, and that's a really a really interesting question that I will continue to think about, that connection of temporality and translation. I do see, as I see Yuachkani as theorizing Andeanness, I also see them as theorizing translation. I think that they have, throughout their work, gone through different approaches to linguistic and other forms of translation that deserve some further exploration.
Mabel, adelante.
Yes, what you are saying about translation in the group and the concurrent use of different languages, just by chance I was recovering the other day something that Spivak said about translation, that while, you know, the process makes discourses available and accessible, and of course we all know the value and the, you know, the necessity of translation. At the same time, with translation, the meaning and the feeling that is inherent to the original culture is lost. We would say lost in translation, of course. I mean, it stays in between languages and is never recuperated. And in a way, that feeling is co-opted by dominant languages.
Right.
So that's an interesting thought, because you know, and especially thinking about subalternism and about decolonization, etc. That's an interesting thought, because we tend to glorify translation and of course understand in an intercultural world the need for that. But at the same time, we need to retain that idea of what it means in the economy of languages and domination, what it really means. Okay, that was just a comment, but I wanted to ask you, or even better, to invite you to elaborate a little bit, because after all, Yuachkani is almost, as you said, half a century by now. It's been existing for so many decades. Could you give us just an idea of how it evolved over these 50 years, how it changed or adapted thematically, structurally, visually, etc.?
Yes, I would say that the approach to their theatrical approaches to presenting Peruvian reality just become more and more complex. They become more and more complex in the creation. There's some interesting work that's done on their use of masks, for example, which I really didn't talk about. But the masks, the costumes become more and more elaborate. They're as they learn more dances and more music and more festival traditions, those become incorporated. But they also, and this is something I haven't talked about at all, they do not address exclusively Andean topics. So they begin to explore different aspects of political reality as well. So you have something like El Último Ensayo, which talks about Imasapra, but Vallejo, and well, I guess those are more Andean reality still. But I'm trying to think of No Me Toquen Ese Vals, for example, which looks at urban characters from Lima, right? They also they move back and forth between very intimate, what I call portable plays. I think there is a practical reason for that. It's easier to travel with one or two characters, but then they have some of these like Carta de Chimbote or Santiago or others that are very elaborate productions. They also move between street performance and the theater space. I think that, you know, they go along responding to the urgencies of the political moment, and also incorporating their readings and the different things that they're learning along the way. So there's a certain, there comes a point that there's like a recognizable Yuyachkani-ness, but at the same time, things are always changing. I'm always amazed at both the durability and then the changes in their plays.
Good. Good.
Javier?
Hi, Anne.
Hi, Javier.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. Well, I have a question. I think it's a comment. I'm trying to formulate it. But I'll do my best to say this. So my question is about Yuyashkani and the Andean epistemologies, what you mentioned at the beginning. Because when I was listening to your presentation, I was constantly thinking about the other link of Yuyashkani and Arguedas, but that you mentioned, right, is that Yuyashkani, as you presented their work, they are exploring the multiple dimensions of Landino: urban, rural, historical, present, etc. And it resonates with Argueda's work in the novels and beyond, because he's not only interested in studying ethnicity or indigeneity, but also in exploring the changes in the Andes, in cities, in communities, in haciendas, but also in the city, you know, what you mentioned. But then, so what I see is that there is a huge tension between this idea of lo andino as an epistemological problem, sort of new some categories that have been used, especially in the colonial debates. And on the other hand, the historical dimension of the problem in Arguedas and Yuyashkani, which is the changes, historical changes. For example, the fact that indigenous people are no longer the majority in the country, and the population has passed through a lot of transformations, horrible, interesting, etc., like any social process, right? So it seems to me that sometimes from the epistemological point of view, we tend to oppose or create a dichotomy between indigenous or non-indigenous, indigenous, modern, and even indigenous Western, like Quijano, right? But I don't know if this is something that Yuyashkani is trying to address, contest, or even deal with. So how do you see this in their work?
Yeah, that's a good question that I'm still honestly grappling with. It seems to me that, or maybe it's that Yuyachkani is grappling with it, right? I'm not, oh gosh, I've totally lost my train of thought, Javier.
It's my fault.
No, no, it's, yeah, I think, yes. So Yuyachkani, I think, is constantly, and they're able to do this in theater in a way that that essays or you know, literary fiction are not able to do. I think that they are tackling this problem from so many angles because they're able to appropriate or take charge of space and time and sound and bodily movements and certain kinds of connections with different audience members on different levels. And that's something I tried to show as I was going along, that every one of their plays, I think, is experienced differently by every individual in the audience, and that is where what they're able to do that in a very unique way, because it is theater, but then also because they are Yuyachkani, and so I think that they grapple with these questions, and they answer them multiply, maybe in every frame, in every movement, in every speech act. I don't know if that makes sense, or if that's at all getting to what you're thinking about.
Yes, Anne, thank you.
In connection with that, and do you perceive in the group some kind of or some degree of fundamentalism?
In what sense, fundamentalism?
I don't know. You know, this challenge of interculturality for a group that is so rooted in tradition, language, specificity, particularism. You know, interculturality is a postmodern politics, right? You know, it's something that came about not so long ago. And it's very easy to practice in groups that have not suffered cultural and racial and political and economic antagonism. It's a very different story when that is presented as a project for people who have been victims since colonial times of discrimination, inequality, and so on. So that is the reason why in cultural practices like similar to Yuyaskani, I don't think if there is any other group similar to it, but other kind of cultural performances, fundamentalism is a component because there is an attachment to the right to remain in particularism because it has political principles, because it's the place in they base their claims, really, right? So I don't know how you see that. You see them too rooted or very open to intercultural issues?
I don't see them that way. I really don't. I see them as constantly absorbing, exploring, insisting on a dynamic dialogue among the different cultures that they address and work with. But I'm going to have to think about that. My first reaction is no, but maybe I'm idealizing them or too attached to them.
It's a difficult question because if you think just at the level of the language and you remember, you know, tormented Arguedas is trying to find a way, right? What do I do? Do I mix both languages, but then this is not natural? Or do I speak in indigenous language, in Quechua, and then nobody's going to understand me in the city? But if I speak Spanish, I'm going to, you know, I'm against my own culture and this and that. So, and he ended up, you know, not being able to resolve that situation. And the problem of translation, theoretically and in practice, is right there, right? It's a wonderful case. Theorizing translation. But I mean, the fact that they are still performing in Quechua without translation in order to perform exclusion as they lived it for centuries. I would, if I were answering my own question, I would say that is some kind of a strategic fundamentalism from their part.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, certainly Yuyaskani is I mean, if Arguedas simply wrote in Quechua, nobody would read him, right? And Yuyaskani is able, and maybe if they had started from that point, the trajectory would have been different. But at this point, Yuyaskani is able to make something like a Santiago, which is, I believe, the majority of the dialogue is in Quechua. And it still can be presented in Argentina and in Los Angeles, right? And so part of that is, again, the medium. They can speak in Quechua, but they can do a whole lot more that allows that person who the audience member who can't understand Quechua to still be engaged in what's going on. And that's something that was just an element, a tool that was not available to Arguedas. But it is absolutely, it is strategic. It is we're not going to, you know, you don't need to know this. You only need to know a bit of it. You don't need to understand It's not for you. Yeah.
It's an ideological gesture. It's
Absolutely.
a political statement. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It would be great to bring the group or part of the group to the United States for a tour, right?
Yeah.
Could, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, I brought them to Trinity 3 times. You know, of course, right now it's impossible. But they go to Puerto Rico a lot.
Yeah.
They have a very close relationship with some really important.
Be from there, you know.
Huh?
In Puerto Rico, maybe we could bring them.
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah. They were always looking for opportunities to come to the States. They really are. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we thank you very much for your talk. We have learned a lot. There's a lot of food for thought.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and as usual. Thank you very much.
It was great seeing you.
Great seeing you, and
yeah.
You know, thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Well,
and
thank you all very much.
You will come in person, and we will go to dinner and celebrate your presence.
That sounds wonderful. I look forward to that. Yeah. Good night, everyone, and thank you.
Night.